The champagne glass shattered against the yacht's marble floor as Ethan Carr watched his ex-wife plummet from the sky like an avenging angel, her red parachute blazing against the Miami sunset. The carefully orchestrated Party 300 of tech's elite, celebrities, and investors erupted into chaos as Natalie landed gracefully on the main deck, her skydiving gear contrasting sharply with the cocktail dresses and designer suits surrounding her. "Hello, darling," she said, unclipping her harness with practiced ease. "Miss me?" 6 months earlier, Ethan had been riding high on what his PR team called the perfect storm of success. His mental health app, MindBridge, had just been acquired by Tech Global for $2.8 billion. The divorce from Natalie had been handled quietly, sealed with non-disclosure agreements, and a settlement that made headlines for its generosity. His new relationship with pop sensation Luna Martinez had the tabloids calling them the power couple of the decade. Tonight's yacht party was supposed to be his victory lap, the final piece in his carefully crafted image rehabilitation. Leo, his young PR manager, had spent weeks curating the guest list, ensuring the perfect mix of tech influencers, A-list celebrities, and venture capitalists. The Azure Dream, a 300-foot super yacht, gleamed under string lights as servers circulated with Dom Perignon and Kobe beef sliders. "The optics are perfect," Leo had whispered to him an hour earlier, adjusting his Hermes tie. Luna's performance. At sunset, the Mental Health Foundation announcement. The Forbes photographer getting those candid shots of you with the kids. From the Miami Children's Hospital. "This is your moment, Ethan." But now, as Natalie stood on his deck in a form-fitting jumpsuit, her blonde hair wild from the wind, Ethan felt that familiar knot in his stomach, the same one he'd felt during their marriage whenever she'd uncovered another corporate scandal for her investigative pieces. "You always did love making an entrance," he said, his voice steady despite the cameras already turning their way. He could see Leo frantically typing on his phone, probably trying to kill any live streams. Natalie smiled, the same dangerous smile that had first captivated him at a tech conference in San Francisco 8 years ago. "This isn't an entrance, Ethan. This is an intervention." 3 more parachutes bloomed above them, Natalie's activist friends from her environmental justice organization, as they landed, unfurling banners that read "Ask Ethan about Project Mindlock" and "Mental Health or Mental Manipulation." The party guests began murmuring nervously. "Security," Leo hissed into his earpiece. But Ethan raised a hand to stop them. He knew Natalie well enough to recognize this wasn't just a publicity stunt. She had something, and the worst thing he could do was create a scene that would dominate social media for weeks. "What do you want, Nat?" he asked quietly, stepping closer to her, even angry and wine-blown. She was breathtaking. The jumpsuit accentuated her curves, and he caught himself remembering their honeymoon in Santorini, when she'd convinced him to go paragliding despite his fear of heights. "I want the truth," she said, pulling a waterproof envelope from her gear. "About MindBridge, about the real reason you sold it, about what you've been doing with all that beautiful, vulnerable mental health data." The knot in Ethan's stomach tightened. Round them, the party had gone from festive to tense, with guests pulling out phones to record the confrontation. Luna Martinez, stunning in a silver gown, watched from the upper deck with undisguised fascination. "You signed an NDA," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "I signed an NDA about our marriage," Natalie corrected, her voice carrying clearly across the deck. "But I never signed anything about what I discovered after you kicked me out of our house." She opened the envelope, revealing what looked like printed emails and corporate documents. "Tell me, darling, do your investors know that MindBridge wasn't just collecting therapy session data to improve mental health outcomes? Do they know about the insurance partnerships, the employee monitoring contracts, the government data sharing agreements?" Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Project Mindlock had been his secret weapon, a predictive algorithm that analyzed therapy session transcripts to identify potential corporate risks, insurance fraud, and even employee loyalty issues. It had been the real reason Tech Global had paid so much for the acquisition. "You don't understand the bigger picture," he said, stepping closer until he could smell her familiar perfume mixing with the salt air. That data saves lives. We've prevented 17 suicides, caught 12 cases of domestic abuse, and flagged 43 people as employment risks based on their private therapy sessions. Natalie interrupted and sold insurance companies predictive models about who's likely to file mental health claims, and helped 3 governments identify dissidents through their depression patterns. The crowd around them had gone silent, except for the clicking of camera phones. Ethan could see his carefully constructed empire cracking like ice in spring. But as he looked at Natalie, fierce, beautiful, uncompromising, he felt something else stirring beneath his panic. The same electric attraction that had made him fall in love with her investigative brilliance, even when it complicated his business deals. "You always were too good for me," he murmured, close enough now that only she could hear him. For a moment, her expression softened. "That was never the problem, Ethan. The problem was that you were too good for this." The Azure Dreams main salon had been cleared of all but the most essential guests, Leo frantically working his phone to control the narrative, Luna Martinez nursing a martini, while Liv tweeting the drama, and a handful of tech journalists who smelled blood in the water. Ethan had managed to convince Natalie to move their confrontation away from the main deck, but he could feel his world shifting beneath him like the yacht's gentle motion on the waves. "Show them," Natalie said to her skydiving companion, a lean woman with intricate tattoos covering her arms. "Show them what we found in the Tech Global Acquisition documents." Tessa, Natalie's friend and fellow activist, pulled out a tablet and began projecting documents onto the salon's wall-mounted screen. Internal emails, financial reports, and what looked like government contracts filled the display. Project Mindlock wasn't just about data collection, Natalie continued, her voice steady as she addressed the room. It was about prediction and control. Europe listened to therapy sessions, analyzed speech patterns, tracked behavioral changes, and created psychological profiles that were sold to employers, insurers, and intelligence agencies. Ethan watched Luna's face as she absorbed the implications. The pop star's carefully maintained image was built on mental health advocacy. She'd spoken openly about her own struggles with anxiety and depression. The irony wasn't lost on him that she was discovering his betrayal of that cause in real time. In front of cameras, "That's an oversimplification," Ethan said, but his voice lacked conviction. The technology was designed to help people. The predictive models could identify someone heading toward a mental health crisis before they hurt themselves or others by violating doctor-patient confidentiality. Natalie shot back. By turning therapy sessions into corporate intelligence gathering, by making people's most vulnerable moments into profit centers. Leo appeared at Ethan's elbow, whispering urgently, "We need to shut this down. Legal says we can get an injunction." "No," Ethan said sharply. He was watching Natalie, remembering the night she'd uncovered the Toronto story for the Washington Post, how she'd stayed up until dawn cross-referencing documents and making connections that everyone else had missed. She'd been relentless then, beautiful in her pursuit of truth, and he'd made love to her against the backdrop of her cluttered home office, surrounded by evidence of corporate malfeasance. "You want to know why I really sold Mindbridge?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying across the salon. The room fell silent. "Because 3 months before the acquisition, I realized what we'd built, and I was terrified of what I'd become." Natalie's expression shifted, surprise flickering across her features. "The night you moved out," Ethan continued, "I sat in my office, reading therapy transcripts, hundreds of them, people talking about their marriages falling apart, their struggles with infidelity, their fears about their careers, and I realized I was reading my own story over and over again. Different voices, same patterns." He moved closer to Natalie, drawn by an invisible force that had always existed between them. A successful man, so focused on building his empire that he loses sight of what matters. A man who justifies increasingly questionable decisions by telling himself it's for the greater good. A man who pushes away the woman he loves because her integrity makes him confront his own compromises. "Ethan," Natalie's voice was softer now, confused. "I sold the company because I couldn't bear to keep running it. But I couldn't tell you that because it would have meant admitting that everything you said about me during our fights was true, that I'd become exactly the kind of person you'd spent your career exposing." Luna Martinez stood up abruptly, her martini glass hitting the coffee table with a sharp clink. Are you seriously having a marital therapy session in front of 3 million livestream viewers? The comment broke the tension, and nervous laughter rippled through the room. But Ethan kept his eyes on Natalie, seeing something in her expression that he hadn't seen in months, not anger or determination, but vulnerability. If that's true, she said quietly, why the foundation? Why the mental health advocacy? Why? Luna, she gestured toward the pop star, who was now reapplying her lipstick with practiced indifference. Because I thought I could buy my way back to being a good person, Ethan admitted. I thought if I gave away enough money, dated someone with the right causes, threw the right parties, I thought I could become the man you wanted me to be without actually doing the work. Natalie stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. I never wanted you to be anyone else, Ethan. I just wanted you to be honest about who you were. The yacht's gentle motion seemed to push them together, and for a moment, they were alone despite the crowded room. Ethan remembered their wedding night, dancing on the deck of a much smaller boat in the San Francisco Bay. Natalie laughing as he spun her under the stars. He'd promised her then that success would never change him, that he'd always choose love over profit, truth over convenience. I've missed you, he whispered, his hand finding hers. I've missed who you used to be, she replied, but she didn't pull away. Behind them, Leo cleared his throat loudly. Ethan, we really need to address the legal implications here. If these documents are authentic, they're authentic, Tessa interrupted, her voice cutting through the romantic tension. And there's more. Tell him about the suicide data, Nat. Natalie's expression hardened again, and she stepped back from Ethan. Project Mindlock didn't just predict who might hurt themselves. It predicted who would be most susceptible to targeted advertising, political messaging, and behavioral manipulation. You built a mental health app that was actually a psychological warfare platform. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd known about the advertising applications, had even convinced himself they were benign, helping depressed people find products that might improve their mood, connecting anxious individuals with relevant services. But hearing it described as warfare, that wasn't the intention. He started. Intention doesn't matter when the impact is real. Natalie cut him off. Do you know how many people were denied jobs because your algorithm flagged their therapy discussions about work stress? How many insurance claims were rejected because your system identified pre-existing psychological conditions? How many political dissidents were identified and monitored because they talked to their therapists about government policies? The salon fell silent except for the gentle hum of the yacht's engines and the distant sound of waves. Ethan felt the weight of what he'd built and what he'd destroyed settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Luna Martinez stood up, smoothing her silver dress. Well, this has been fascinating, but I think my publicist would murder me if I stayed for the rest of this corporate confession. She paused at the door, looking back at Ethan with something that might have been pity. For what it's worth, the sex was mediocre anyway. As she left, taking several of the tech journalists with her, Ethan realized that his carefully constructed new life was dissolving around him. But strangely, instead of panic, he felt something resembling relief. The yacht's upper deck had emptied of all but the most dedicated voyeurs, leaving Ethan and Natalie alone with the Miami skyline glittering in the distance. The party below continued in muted tones, guests uncertain whether to leave or stay for what promised to be the social media event of the year. Leo had finally stopped pacing and was sitting in a corner, fielding calls from lawyers, reporters, and what sounded like very angry tech global executives. You know what the worst part is? Natalie said, leaning against the railing. The wind had calmed, and her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She'd unzipped the top of her jumpsuit, revealing the black lace camisole underneath, the same kind she'd worn during their marriage, a detail that made Ethan's chest tighten with unexpected longing. Tell me, he said, moving to stand beside her. The worst part is that you were brilliant, she continued, her voice barely audible over the water lapping against the yacht's hull. The original Mindbridge concept was beautiful, an app that actually helped people process trauma, connect with resources, track their mental health journey. You could have changed the world. Ethan stared out at the water, remembering the early days when Mindbridge had been just him and 2 college friends. Working out of a Berkeley coffee shop, they'd built the first prototype after his roommate's suicide, driven by a genuine desire to prevent other families from experiencing that kind of loss. When did it change? Natalie asked. When did helping people become secondary to monetizing their pain? Series B funding. Ethan answered without hesitation. Venture capital partners wanted to see scalable revenue streams and data monetization strategies. They said good intentions didn't pay back $40 million investments. So you compromised. I rationalized, Ethan corrected. I told myself that if we didn't grow aggressively, someone else would build a worse version. If we didn't monetize the data, we couldn't afford to keep helping people. Every ethical corner we cut was justified as serving the greater good. Natalie turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the yacht's deck lights. And what about our marriage? How did you rationalize that? The question hit deeper than all her corporate accusations. Ethan felt the familiar cocktail of guilt and defensive anger rising in his chest. You want to do this now here? I want to understand, she said, stepping closer, because I've spent the last 6 months trying to figure out how the man who used to read me poetry in bed became someone who could lie to my face about industrial-scale privacy violations. Her fingers traced the lapel of his jacket, the same unconscious gesture she'd made throughout their marriage when she was trying to connect with him. The touch sent electricity through his system, awakening memories of their physical intimacy, long Sunday mornings, tangled in Egyptian cotton sheets, spontaneous encounters in his home office when she'd visit him during late work sessions, the way she'd arch her back when he touched her just right. You were getting too close, he admitted. Your investigative instincts were kicking in every time I came home from work. You'd ask questions about user privacy, about our data partnerships, about why I was suddenly traveling so much to meet with government contractors. Because I loved you, Natalie said, her hand moving to cup his face. Because I could see you changing, and I was trying to save you from yourself. I know, Ethan whispered, covering her hand with his own. But I couldn't let you see what I'd become, so I started lying. Small lies at first, telling you meetings were about product development when they were about data, sales, saying I was visiting the LA office when I was in Washington briefing intelligence agencies. And then bigger lies, then bigger lies. He closed his eyes, remembering the night she'd found the encrypted phone he used for Project Mindlock communications. The fight that had lasted until dawn. Her tears when she realized the depth of his deception, the way she'd looked at him like he was a stranger. I told myself I was protecting you, he continued, that if you didn't know the details, you couldn't be implicated if anything went wrong. But really, I was protecting myself from your judgment. Natalie's thumb brushed across his cheekbone, and he opened his eyes to find her studying his face with the same intensity she'd once brought to her investigative work. The affairs were part of it too, weren't they? She asked quietly. Ethan's breath caught. They'd never spoken directly about his infidelity. It had been an unspoken wound that had festered beneath their other problems. How long have you known? Since the beginning, she said, surprising him. Luna wasn't your first. There was the venture capitalist in New York, the marketing consultant in Austin, the government liaison in D.C. Nat, I'm not asking for an apology, she interrupted. I'm asking you to be honest about why. Ethan felt exposed, more vulnerable than he'd been even during the corporate revelations downstairs. Because with them, I could be the person you fell in love with, the idealistic entrepreneur, the brilliant innovator, the man who was going to change the world. With you, I had to face what I'd actually become. So you gave them the fantasy and gave me the lies. Yes, the admission hung between them like a physical presence. Below them, the party was winding down. Guests drifting toward the tender boats that would take them back to shore. Soon, they would be alone with the consequences of the evening's revelations. I should hate you, Natalie said, her voice thoughtful rather than angry. You should, Ethan agreed. Instead, she kissed him. It was desperate and familiar and completely unexpected. Her mouth soft against his as her fingers tangled in his hair. Ethan responded instinctively, his arms encircling her waist, pulling her. against him as months of separation and anger dissolved into pure physical need. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Natalie rested her forehead against his chest. "This doesn't fix anything," she whispered. "I know. I'm still going to destroy you in the media. I know. The leaked documents are just the beginning." Tessa has whistleblowers from inside Tech Global, former Mindbridge employees who were forced to sign NDA letters, and a database of everyone who was harmed by Project Mindlock. Ethan's hands moved to frame her face, tilting her chin up until she met his eyes. "Then I guess I better figure out how to be the man who deserves your forgiveness before you're done with me. And how are you going to do that?" For the first time in months, Ethan smiled genuinely. "I'm going to help you." The penthouse suite of the Four Seasons Miami had been transformed into a war room. Laptops covered every surface, documents were pinned to makeshift bulletin boards, and empty coffee cups testified to the 36 hours of non-stop work that had followed the yacht party disaster. Ethan sat across from Natalie at the dining table, both of them surrounded by legal pads covered in notes, their earlier antagonism replaced by the familiar rhythm of collaborative investigation. "The Tech Global acquisition documents show they knew exactly what they were buying," Natalie said, highlighting another section of corporate emails. "They weren't interested in the mental health applications, they wanted the surveillance infrastructure." Ethan nodded, his finger tracing through bank records on his laptop screen. "And they paid a premium for it. Look at this, the base acquisition price was $1.2 billion for the technology and user base. The additional $1.6 billion was specifically for what they called predictive intelligence assets. They'd been working together since dawn. Tessa and her activist network, providing a steady stream of leaked documents while Ethan used his insider knowledge to decode the corporate euphemisms and technical specifications. The sexual tension from their encounter on the yacht remained, crackling beneath their professional focus like an electrical current waiting to arc. "We need to be careful about how we release this," Natalie said, stretching back in her chair. The movement pulled her t-shirt tight across her chest, and Ethan found himself momentarily distracted by the familiar curve of her breasts. "If we dump everything at once, the story gets buried under information overload. We need a strategic rollout." "Agreed," Ethan said, forcing himself to focus on the documents rather than the way her yoga pants hugged her hips. "What's our timeline?" "Tessa's connections at the Post and Times want the story broken simultaneously," Natalie replied, moving to stand behind his chair. Her hands settled on his shoulders as she leaned down to look at his screen, her hair brushing against his cheek. "But we need more than just corporate malfeasance. We need human impact stories." Her touch sent warmth through his muscles, reminding him of countless late nights during their marriage when she'd massage his shoulders. As he worked on code or business plans, without thinking, he reached up to cover one of her hands with his own. "I have those," he said quietly. "User records from people who were harmed by the data sharing. Employment terminations, insurance denials, government surveillance victims. I've been carrying the guilt about specific cases for months." Natalie's hands stilled. "You kept records of the people who were hurt." "I couldn't delete them," Ethan admitted. "Every time I tried, I'd see their faces in the user photos, read their therapy transcripts about how the system failed them. It felt like erasing evidence of my sins." "Ethan." Her voice was soft, surprised. He turned in his chair to face her. Their bodies suddenly closed in the intimate space between his seat and where she stood. "I know it doesn't excuse anything, but I need you to know that I never stopped caring about the people we were supposed to help." Natalie's hands moved from his shoulders to frame his face, her thumbs brushing along his jawline. "Show me," she whispered. For a moment, he thought she meant the user records. Then she leaned down and kissed him, and he understood she meant something else entirely. This kiss was different from their desperate encounter on the yacht, slower, deeper, weighted with months of separation and the strange intimacy of working together again. When she pulled back, her eyes were dark with desire. "We shouldn't," she breathed, even as her fingers began unbuttoning his shirt. "Definitely not," Ethan agreed, his hands finding the hem of her t-shirt. "This complicates everything. Everything's already complicated." She laughed, the sound breathless and familiar. And then they were moving together toward the bedroom. leaving the evidence of corporate conspiracy scattered across the suite's dining table. In the bedroom, morning light streamed through floor to ceiling, windows overlooking Biscayne Bay. Natalie pulled her shirt over her head, revealing the black lace bra that matched her camisole from the night before. Ethan's breath caught. She was exactly as he remembered. Curves he'd memorized during 8 years of marriage, skin that responded to his touch like it had been designed specifically for his hands. "I've missed this," he said, reaching for her. "I've missed you," she corrected, stepping into his arms. Their lovemaking was intense, desperate, colored by months of anger and longing. Ethan worshipped her body with the reverence of a man who thought he'd lost something precious forever, while Natalie claimed him with the fierce passion of a woman reclaiming what was rightfully hers. When they finally collapsed together, breathless and tangled in hotel sheets, the Miami sun had climbed high enough to warm their skin through the windows. "This doesn't mean I forgive you," Natalie said, her head resting on his chest. "I know," Ethan replied, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "And it doesn't mean we're getting back together. I know. We're still going to destroy your reputation and probably send you to prison." Ethan pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm counting on it." They lay in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the distant sounds of Miami traffic and ocean waves. Finally, Natalie propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. "What happens after?" she asked. "After the story breaks, after the investigations, after Tech Global and the government agencies circle the wagons?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "I testify against everyone involved. I turn over every document, every algorithm, every piece of evidence that proves Project Mindlock was designed to exploit vulnerable people. I face whatever legal consequences come from that. And then I try to build something better. Not another tech company. I think I've proven I can't be trusted with that kind of power. Maybe a legal clinic for people harmed by surveillance technology. Maybe a foundation that actually helps people instead of surveilling them. Maybe I just disappear and let someone more trustworthy take the lead." Natalie studied his face, searching for signs of deception or self-serving rationalization. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that." She kissed him again, softer this time, almost tender. "Then maybe there's hope for you after all." A loud knock on the suite's front door interrupted the moment, followed by Tess's voice calling. "The Post editors want to see the leaked emails in 2 hours. And the FBI just issued a statement about investigating Tech Global's government contracts." Natalie sighed and reached for her clothes. Back to work, Ethan agreed. But he caught her hand before she could stand. "Nat, thank you for giving me the chance to do the right thing." She squeezed his fingers. "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see what we're about to unleash." 6 months later, Ethan sat in a congressional hearing room, facing a panel of senators and a gallery packed with journalists, former Mindbridge users, and privacy advocates. The mahogany-paneled chamber felt appropriately solemn for what had become the most significant tech industry whistleblowing case since Cambridge Analytica. "Mr. Carr," Senator Patricia Williams said, adjusting her glasses as she consulted her notes, "in your testimony, you've stated that Project Mindlock was designed from the beginning to exploit user mental health data for commercial and governmental surveillance purposes. Is that correct?" "Yes, Senator," Ethan replied into the microphone. "What began as a genuine effort to help people process trauma and access mental health resources was systematically corrupted into a tool for psychological manipulation and social control." In the gallery behind him, he could see Natalie taking notes, her press credentials clearly visible around her neck. She'd been covering the hearings for a consortium of investigative journalism organizations, her reporting on Project Mindlock having won her a Pulitzer Prize and restored her reputation as one of the country's most fearless corporate investigators. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media interviews, and congressional testimonies. Tech Global's stock had crashed. 3 government agencies were under investigation for illegal surveillance partnerships, and Ethan himself faced federal charges for privacy violations and wire fraud. But strangely, he'd never felt more at peace. "And you chose to cooperate with law enforcement and congressional investigators." Despite knowing it would result in criminal charges against yourself, Senator Williams continued, "Yes, ma'am, the people who trusted Mindbridge with their most vulnerable moments deserved to know how that trust was betrayed, and the public deserved to understand how their personal mental health data was being weaponized against them." Mr. Carr, interrupted Senator Robert Hayes, a Republican from Texas known for his tech industry connections. "Your ex-wife's organization has received significant funding from your personal assets during these proceedings. Some might suggest this cooperation is merely an attempt to influence your sentencing or rehabilitate your public image." Ethan glanced back at Natalie, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "Senator, I've donated approximately 85% of my liquid assets to organizations that provide free legal aid to surveillance victims, fund mental health services that maintain genuine privacy protections, and support investigative journalism. This isn't about my image or my sentence, it's about trying to repair some of the damage I caused." "And your relationship with Ms. Carr?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan had been dreading this moment, knowing that their personal relationship would inevitably become part of the public narrative. "Natalie and I have been working together to ensure the truth about Project Mindlock reaches the public," he said. "Carefully, our professional collaboration has been entirely focused on accountability and reform." It was technically true, though it omitted the complexity of their personal reconciliation. They hadn't remarried. Natalie had been clear that legal commitment was off the table until Ethan proved he could sustain ethical behavior long term. But they'd been living together for 3 months, rebuilding their relationship with the same methodical intensity they'd brought to exposing corporate corruption. "Mr. Carr," Senator Williams said, "what would you say to the Americans who are now afraid to seek mental health treatment because they fear their private conversations might be monitored or sold?" This was the question that kept Ethan awake at night. The mental health implications of the Project Mindlock revelations had been devastating. Therapy app downloads had plummeted. People were avoiding digital mental health resources, and several studies suggested that fear of surveillance was preventing people from seeking help they desperately needed. "I would say that their fear is rational and justified," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "I would say that I'm profoundly sorry for contributing to a system that violated their trust and made them less safe. And I would say that we need comprehensive federal legislation to ensure that mental health data receives the strongest possible privacy protection, stronger than financial data, stronger than medical records, stronger than anything else we currently protect by law, and such legislation is currently being drafted." "Yes, Senator, the Mental Health Privacy Act, which Senators Williams, Chen, and Rodriguez are sponsoring, would create criminal penalties for mental health data surveillance, require explicit opt-in consent for any data sharing, and establish a victim compensation fund for people harmed by psychological surveillance programs." Senator Williams smiled slightly. "And you support this legislation even though it would make future projects like Mindbridge effectively impossible?" "Especially because it would make future projects like Mindbridge impossible," Ethan replied. The hearing concluded an hour later with closing statements from the committee chair about the need for accountability in the tech industry and the importance of protecting Americans' most vulnerable data. As the gallery emptied, Ethan felt a hand on his shoulder. "Not bad for a reformed tech villain," Natalie said, falling into step beside him as they walked toward the Capitol building's exit. "Think it'll make a difference? The legislation? Absolutely. Your testimony was the smoking gun they needed to push it through. The personal redemption arc." She paused, considering. "That's still a work in progress." They emerged into the bright DC sunshine, where a crowd of reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Ethan had learned to navigate media scrums over the past months, but he still felt the familiar anxiety spike as questions began flying. "Mr. Carr, do you think your sentence will reflect your cooperation? Mr. Carr, is it true you're starting a new company? Mr. Carr, can you comment on your relationship with your ex-wife?" Natalie stepped forward, her journalist credentials giving her authority among the media pack. "Mr. Carr will be making a statement about his future plans later this week. Right now, the focus should be on the legislative response to Project Mindlock and supporting the victims of psychological surveillance. As they pushed through the crowd toward their waiting car, Ethan marveled at how naturally Natalie had stepped into the role of protecting him from media attention, the same attention she'd once used as a weapon against him. "You know," he said once they were safely in the backseat of their Uber 6 months ago, "I thought my life was over when you dropped out of that plane." Natalie settled against his shoulder, her hand finding his. "Maybe it was. Maybe that person's life needed to end so you could figure out who you actually wanted to be." "And who do I want to be?" She tilted her head to look at him, her green eyes serious. "I think you want to be the man I fell in love with 8 years ago. The one who built technology to help people instead of exploit them. The one who chose truth over profit, even when it was hard. Do you think I can be that man again?" "I think you're already becoming him." They rode in comfortable silence through the DC traffic, both lost in thought about the future they were cautiously building together. Ethan's sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month. His lawyers estimated 6 to 18 months in minimum security prison, depending on how much weight the judge gave to his cooperation. It would be their first real test as a couple, maintaining their relationship while he served time for his crimes. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt genuinely optimistic about the future. He'd lost his company, his fortune, and his reputation, but he'd regained something more valuable: his integrity, and the woman who'd never stopped believing he could reclaim it. "I love you," he said quietly as their car pulled up to their hotel. "I love you too," Natalie replied. "All of you, even the parts that made terrible mistakes." As they walked into the hotel lobby, hand in hand, Ethan realized that sometimes the only way to find your way back to who you were meant to be was to lose everything you thought you wanted. 3 years later, Ethan stood in the visiting room of the Federal Correctional Institution in Otisville, New York, watching through reinforced glass as Natalie approached with their adoption paperwork in her hands. He'd served 14 months of his sentence, and in 2 weeks, he would be released to begin 3 years of supervised probation. "She's beautiful," Natalie said, sliding the photos across the metal table between them. 8 years old, from foster care in Miami. She's been through 3 families, and she specifically asked for parents who understand what it's like when grown-ups make mistakes. Ethan studied the picture of a serious-faced little girl with dark curls and intelligent eyes. "What's her name?" "Sophia. And she wants to know if her new dad is really the man from the news who went to jail for trying to help people the wrong way." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that sometimes the best people are the ones who've learned from their biggest mistakes." Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes, a response that would have embarrassed him during his corporate days, but now felt like evidence of his humanity returning. "Do you really think we can do this? Raise a child who's already been let down by so many adults?" Natalie reached across the table to take his hands. Her wedding ring, they'd remarried in a simple ceremony 6 months earlier, catching the fluorescent light. "I think we're exactly the right people for her." A reformed tech executive who learned that success means helping people, and a journalist who specializes in holding powerful people accountable. "She'll never wonder if we're telling her the truth. And if I mess up again, if the temptation to take shortcuts becomes too strong, then she'll watch you take responsibility for your mistakes and do better, just like she's learning to do." The visiting hour ended too soon, but as Ethan was escorted back to his cell, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about the future. Not because of what he might gain or achieve, but because of who he might become, in service to others. 2 weeks later, Natalie waited in the prison parking lot, their new daughter Sophia beside her in the passenger seat of their modest Honda sedan. When Ethan emerged with his single bag of possessions, Sophia rolled down her window and called out, "Are you ready to be my dad now?" "I'm ready to try," Ethan called back, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. As they drove away from the prison toward their new life in a small house in suburban Maryland, close enough to DC for Natalie's work, far enough away for privacy, Sophia peppered Ethan with questions about prison, about his crimes, about whether he would ever hurt people again. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes," he told her honestly, "but I can promise that if I do, I'll tell you the truth about them and work to fix whatever I broke." "That's what Mom said you'd say." Sophia replied, apparently satisfied with this answer. What else did Mom tell you about me? She said you used to be scared of heights, but you're not anymore because you learned that. Sometimes you have to jump out of airplanes to land where you're supposed to be. Ethan looked at Natalie in the rearview mirror, seeing her smile at the metaphor. She's not wrong about that. Their new life wasn't glamorous. Ethan worked as a cybersecurity consultant for nonprofits. While serving his probation, Natalie continued her investigative reporting, and Sophia thrived in her new school, where her parents' unconventional story made her something of a celebrity among her classmates. But it was real in a way that Ethan's previous life of luxury and deception had never been. The Mental Health Privacy Act had passed 18 months earlier, creating the strongest digital privacy protections in U.S. history. The Victim Compensation Fund Ethan had testified about had distributed over $100 million to people harmed by Project Mindlock, and Tech Global had been broken up by federal regulators, its surveillance infrastructure dismantled, and its executives facing their own criminal charges. But the real measure of change, Ethan knew, wasn't in the headlines or policy victories. It was in small moments: Sophia trusting him to help with her homework, Natalie falling asleep in his arms without checking her phone for security alerts, the satisfaction of helping a small nonprofit protect their donors' data from corporate surveillance on the third anniversary of the yacht party that had changed everything. Ethan and Natalie stood on the deck of a much smaller boat in the Chesapeake Bay, watching Sophia practice her sailing knots while the sun set over the water. "Do you ever miss it?" Natalie asked. "The money, the power, the feeling of being important." Ethan considered the question seriously. "I miss the illusion that I was helping people, but I don't miss the reality of what I was actually doing. And I definitely don't miss the person I was becoming." "Who were you becoming?" "Someone who could justify anything if it served my vision of the greater good. Someone who thought other people's privacy and dignity were acceptable costs for my success. Someone who lied to himself so effectively that he almost forgot what the truth looked like." Natalie leaned against his shoulder, watching their daughter concentrate on her sailing lesson with the same intensity she'd once brought to investigating corporate malfeasance. "You know what I learned from all this?" she said. "What's that?" "That sometimes the most important truth isn't about exposing other people's lies. Sometimes it's about being honest enough to face your own." As they sailed back toward shore, Sophia chattering excitedly about everything she'd learned, Ethan reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd lost everything he thought mattered and found everything that actually did. He'd been forced to confront the worst parts of himself and discovered that redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the work. The sky above them was clear and endless. No planes carrying protest banners, no parachutes delivering unwelcome truths, just a family sailing home together, carried by honest wind toward an uncertain but hopeful future.